Hi everyone, in today's video I'm going to be showing you how to create this baseball cap from start to finish. So this course is actually part of one of my main products on Gumroad that shows you how to create 10 hats, but I decided to share one of the courses completely for free with my YouTube community. So let me know what you think, and without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so first things first, I want you to go to Preferences, Gizmo, and select Local Coordinate. So this is just going to make your life a lot easier when it comes to moving the 2D patterns around in the 3D workspace. Then I want you to go to File, Open Project, and if you go to the 6-panel cap project file, you'll see that there's a project file called Mail Project File. So just click on Open, leave this default, click on OK, it'll load in the project file, and we can get started. Okay, so I'm going to start by going to my object browser Fabric, double click on here and just name this cap main. Press enter. I'm going to change the color to a darker gray, and immediately I'm going to change my physical property preset. So I'll click on this drop down arrow and I want to use cotton heavy canvas. So this fabric has some rigidity applied to it, but it still allows some folds to be visible. So it's a really good fabric preset. So I'll select that, and now we can start creating our pattern. So I'm going to go over here, hold down my left mouse button, select rectangle, left click to bring up this dialog box. My width is going to be 97 and the height is going to be 100, and I'll click on OK. Now I'm just going to click on transform pattern, left click over here to deselect everything, go to add point, hover over this line, right click, select uniform split on 2 and click on OK. Now I'm going to go to edit pattern, and while I'm selecting this point, I'm going to click and drag this up. Now obviously you can see there's numbers on this pattern, so you can right click and go to show line length in earlier versions, or in Marvelous Designer 10 go to this icon and enable this so you can see these numbers. So I'm going to click on this point and just drag this up, or I can hold on shift to constrain it and make a completely straight line, and I want that value to reach 87. Doesn't need to be exactly 87, 87.3 is fine, and there we go. Now I'm going to go to this feature called smooth curve. And now if I click and drag over here, it adds some curvature. So you'll see as I click and drag, this point, once it reaches the point at the top, I'll no longer be able to add curvature, and that's exactly what I want. So I'll do that for the other side as well. And this is going to be one of our panel shapes. So we are creating a 6-panel cap, and I actually want to be able to make any changes to one of the pattern pieces, and it should affect all of them. So the easiest way to do that is to create instances of this pattern. So you can right click and you can see over here there's an option called instance pattern. So it's basically creating a duplicate. So as soon as I left click, it places that instance. So this basically means whatever I do to this first pattern is going to affect this pattern as well. You can see if I move this down, it does that to the other pattern. So now I'm going to go back to my transform pattern, select this, Control C, Control V, and Control C, Control V, Control V, and Control V, until we have 6 of these panels. But you'll see that the instance is only on these 2 panels. So how do I get it on all of them? All you have to do is just click and drag to make a selection box over all of them. Right click and you'll see there's an option here called apply linked editing. Then just click on instance pattern. So now it makes all of these pattern pieces an instance of the first one. So whatever I do over here now affects all of these 6 panel pieces. So now we can arrange this within the 3D workspace. So in terms of arranging these patterns, you'll see in the 3D workspace, as soon as I left click on here, and as long as you have local coordinates selected, it's just going to make your life easier. You'll be able to position these pattern pieces. So I want to arrange it like this. I want two of these pattern pieces in the front, 2 on the back, and 1 on either side. Also make sure you've got thin textured surface selected so that you can see the dark region on this pattern. This is the normal, and it should always be facing the character. So like I said, I want 2 on the front, 2 on the back, and 1 on either side. Alright, so I'll just position it like this. And then I want these 2 on the back, so I can select both of them like this. Now if my gizmo disappears while I'm holding down shift to select both, just left click again and it will bring up that gizmo, and just put this behind the character. Now in order to get these normals to be facing the correct way, all I have to do is right click and just go to flip normal, and it's going to be facing this way. There we go. So all of the dark regions are facing my character, and I've got this set up. So now it's time to sew these pieces together. So I'm going to be sewing in the 3D workspace. It's just a lot easier to do. I'm going to go to free sewing, right? Because if I use segment sewing, you can see we can only sew up until that point. But the easiest way is to use free sewing, which means I can go down this entire region. So I'm going to left click over here to put my first dot. Once I reach the bottom, I'm going to double click to complete that sewing region. And now I'm sewing it onto this side. So left click, once I reach the bottom, double click, and now it sews those pieces together. So now I'm sewing here, double click, over here, double click. And again, you can see exactly what's happening in this 2D workspace. So double click, and then double click. Do the same thing here. You can see free sewing really comes in handy, especially for something like this. Double click and double click. Right, so this is going to be our pattern. So if I press, actually before I press spacebar to simulate this, I'm going to go to my transform pattern, click and drag over all of these pattern pieces and just bring the particle distance down to 10. Right, not only is it going to give me better quality, but it also helps with the overall simulation, with the accuracy of the simulation. Now I'm going to press spacebar. And there we go. So just obviously help this because right now our character cannot see anything. And just help this on your character's head to position it, like angle it in a way that you think a cap would actually be, you know, positioned on somebody's head. Okay, so we got all of those 6 panels sewed together really nicely. Now obviously we can adjust the way it's sitting on the character's head throughout the tutorial, but as long as it's on their head right now, that is the main thing. We need the cap on their head. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it like that for now. Just make sure yours is sewed and positioned on your character's head. So it's time to create the brim for our cap, and if we actually look at some real images over here, you can see that the brim is connected to these 2 front panels, and a part of it's also connected to the side panel. So I'll show you how to create the brim and how to sew it on like this. Alright, so let's get started. So I'm going to go over here, hold on my left mouse button, select rectangle. Now what you really need to be paying attention to, remember, because we're sewing it onto the 2 front panels and onto the side as well, but you just want to pay attention to this value. So whatever this value is, mine is 97, times that by 2, so that's going to give me 194. So for my rectangle, I'm just going to left click over here. My width is going to be 194, and for the height, I'll put that on 50. Now I want to add some curvature to our brim. So I'm going to go to my edit curvature. Just click and drag over here to add some curvature. Or maybe not too much. Maybe like that should be fine. Then I want to add some curvatures over here as well. Just like that. Then I'm going to go to edit pattern, select this bottom line, and just click and drag to extend the overall, you know, length of the brim. And then to add that finishing touch onto this pattern, you want to go to your smooth curve. And I'm just going to click and drag over here. So pay attention to this value that's being generated. I'm going to drag mine up until 33. 33.4 is fine. I'll do the same over here. Try and match that. So 33.5. That's close enough. Right, so we've got our basic brim. Now I'm just going to move this up and rotate it and just bring it closer to the head over here. Right, so immediately what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to add a little bit more curvature onto this line. So I'm going to go to my edit pattern, select this line, and you can see these anchor points. If I click and drag them to bring them down, I'm adding a little bit more curvature. So by adding more curvature onto this line, it also helps with the overall shape. It makes this part of the brim stand up a little bit more instead of being angled down like this. So curvature over here really does make a difference. So that should be fine. We've got our shape, and now it's time to sew it. Okay, so we're sewing it onto the 2 front panels and onto the side. But on the side, in order to sew a part of this brim onto the side, I need to place a point over here so that we can create a smaller segment to sew it onto. But I need to go to my transform pattern, and I want to remove the linked instance editing off all of these patterns. So I'll just click and drag like this, right click and go to remove linked editing. Now I can edit them individually. So you'll see whenever I click on a pattern piece, it obviously shows me what I'm clicking on, but there's also a blue dot that gives an indication of where you're clicking on the pattern. So over here I want to reference this area because this is where I know where I need to add a point. So I'm just going to left click to deselect everything, go to add point, hover over this line on this side, right click, and I'm going to type in a value of 20 and click on OK. And do that for the other side as well. So I click over here and make sure I'm deselecting everything, and I want to add a point here. So right click, 20, click on OK. Now on the brim, I'm going to right click on this side, type 20, and on this side as well. And then I want a point down the center, so I'm right clicking and going to uniform split on 2 and click on OK. So now the way we sew this, you can see exactly how it's happening in the 2D workspace. I'm going to go to my segment sewing. I'm sewing this piece onto this piece, this over here. Make sure your lines are straight. If they're not straight, remember you can go to segment sewing, you can right click on a segment line and you can reverse it if your lines are not straight. So I'm sewing this together, and I need to sew this piece over here as well. Now press spacebar and you have a brim. Now you'll notice that, okay, this brim is still using the properties of the cap main, and if you like that, cool, you can keep it. But I'm going to select cap main, copy this, and I'm going to make a new fabric over here and call it brim. Press enter, select the brim, and change my fabric over here to brim. Now let's select the brim fabric. Now if you want to add more rigidity onto this pattern, because you can see it's still a little bit floppy, all you have to do is go to your physical property, and under detail, as long as you increase this bending weft and warp, you add in more rigidity. So increasing this value adds more rigidity, but you can see how it's adjusting the shape. Right? Instead of it being completely curved down like this, I can make it a lot straighter by increasing the weft. And you can see by doing that to the warp, it's also having an effect on the overall rigidity of the cap. So this is a nice way to control this curvature or the shape on the brim, just with this weft and warp value. Right, it makes it really, really easy to do. So I just decided to select these lines and just move them down to extend the length of the brim. And you notice when we look from the top, this brim has got maybe like a really weird angle. So to make this a lot straighter, all you have to do is go to edit pattern, select this line and just move it in a little bit so that it's angled like this. And do the same for this side. Now press spacebar. There you go. Now I might need to go back to my brim fabric over here and just play around maybe a little bit with the weft and the warp amount. You can see that weft is also, by increasing this, it's making that line a lot straighter. And so if you do want that line to be straighter, that's exactly how you would do that. And I'm just going to play around with the way that it fits on my character's head. Okay, if you want this brim, like you'll notice sometimes it keeps getting angled down like that, you need to select this value and add more curvature over here. So if I add more curvature, right, just use these anchor points. If I add a bit more curvature over here, it will stand up a lot more. So that means instead of having my cap completely angled like that on the character's head, I can maybe make this a little bit straighter. But it really depends on how you're trying to fit this on the character's head. Maybe an angled approach looks a little bit better. But anyway, if you feel like the brim keeps angling itself down all the time, just add more curvature over here. Right, I'm just adjusting the curvature a little bit more, just to get something like this. Okay, but we've got our cap. That's the main thing. We've got our curvature. I showed you how to straighten this out as well, so that we don't get that really like strange flared shape. And it's just a matter of adjusting the way it fits on your character's head. So now I want you to select this rim pattern and just put the particle distance on 10 so we get, you know, higher quality, but it will probably also give us a better simulation. But there we go. I'm pretty happy with this brim shape. Maybe the last thing I would do is, depending on how your curvature is over here, I'm actually going to, you can see this has been flared out a little bit more. I'm going to make this follow this line a lot better. And just do it for the other side as well. Alright, and maybe just fix the angle here. I need to adjust this one. Like that. Now it doesn't need to be exactly the same. There we go. So that's going to be my final rim pattern. And I'm pretty happy with that. So I want to visually see this cap a lot better because right now it's paper thin. So if I just click and drag over all of these pattern pieces, and over here by add thickness, I put this on 2, press enter, and then change this to thick textured surface. This gives me a much better representation of what this cap looks like because now it actually has some thickness applied onto it. Right, so we've created the crown with all of these panel pieces and we created the brim. So now I want to create that button at the top of the cap. So I'm going to add a button onto the cap using Marvelous Designer's button feature. So if I go to button and then here on top of the cap, I'll just left click over here. So it's going to load in the button. It'll just take a couple of seconds. And there we go. So you can see in the object browser under button, well, the first thing I want to do is I want to go to select and move and select this button, and I want to deselect collision because this can cause issues with buttons and with garments, and I don't want that to happen. So I want the collision to be turned off, and I'm just going to position it over here. Now I'm going to go back to button, select my default button, and I'm going to change the shape to this shape over here. Right, so you can just scroll down. I'm selecting this one, and then for the width I'm going to put on 11, and then my thickness is on 8. And then I can also change the color. Let's maybe make this a lot darker. There we go. Now I'm going to go to select and move and just move this to the middle of my cap. And the thing is, because there's no collision, it's almost going to be like this button is glued onto this part of the garment. So even if the cap's moving, it's still going to move with the cap. There just won't be any collision. So a lot of the times, like if the fabric comes in contact with the button, it'll basically allow that type of collision to happen. But now I'm preventing that, and it's almost like it's just being glued on here. So once that's in position and I'm happy with it, let me just select a pattern piece so that I can orientate this correctly. There we go. There's a button on there. I'll press spacebar to simulate, and you can see even if I move, the button is still moving with the cap. So I think that's an easy way to add a button onto this cap. You could draft it onto the actual pattern pieces, but if you have a dedicated button feature, then I think it makes sense to use it, especially for something like a button. And there we go. So that's the button in the middle of the cap. Now if I want to, I could always just stop my simulation and make sure I actually have this in the center right over there, and simulate, and voila, we have a button. So it's time to create the eyelets. Now I'm going to just click and drag over here, right click and go to apply linked editing instance pattern. When this pops up, click on OK. So you can see the instancing is only available on these 4 pieces because these ones we modified independently. So I will have to copy and paste the eyelet from here onto these 2 patterns. Anyway, hold on the left mouse button, go to Eternal Ellipse, drag down the mouse till here, and then left click, go to circumference, put this on 20, and click on OK. So while this is still selected, go to Edit Pattern, right click and go to Offset as Internal Line, and do that by 1 millimeter. Now I'm going to double click to select the outside, hold down Shift and double click to select the inside. Then I'm going to press Ctrl C, Ctrl V, and I want to paste it on these 2 patterns that were not affected by the linked instance editing. So over there, then Ctrl V and paste this here. Alright, so now I'm going to start with the ones that are affected with the linked editing. So I'm going to double click over here to select this inside, then right click and go to Convert to Hole. So that'll punch a hole through these pattern pieces. You can see there's a hole in there. Now I need to make sure I'm also doing it for these 2. So double click there, hold on Shift, double click here, right click, Convert to Hole. So now we've got all of these holes in the cap. So now while you still have Edit Pattern selected, double click over here to select this part, and now we're just going to hold down Shift and do it for all of these internal lines. So double click, yeah, it's single click and single click. Just as long as all of these internal lines are selected, you are good to go. Now I'm going to right click and go to cut and sew. So this cuts these pieces off and sews it back on. And it did it for all of the panel pieces. Now go to transform pattern and just hold on shift to select all of these and bring them down so we can actually see our eyelets. Now I'll press spacebar to simulate that, and we have officially created these eyelets for our cap. So this next part is optional. I'm going to be adding a strap to the back of the cap. You can decide if you want to do this, or you can move on to the next video. Anyway, I want to make sure my internal lines is enabled, and I'm going to go and hold on my left mouse button, select internal polygon line. So we're referencing these two back panels. So I'm going to start, remember, I'll left click over here to see where my blue dot is, so I know where I need to start drawing. Even with this one. Right, so I need to start drawing on this side. So just deselect everything, go back to internal polygon line. So I'm going to draw, let's say from here down to the bottom. That should be fine. And then I'm going to go to edit curvature and add some curvature like this. Then I'm going to go back to my edit pattern. Now, very important, make sure this anchor point is straight, because if you angle it like this, it's going to create like this weird pattern on the back of the hat, and that's not what you want. Right, so just make that straight. Now I can choose whatever shape I want over here. Maybe move this in a little bit more. Right, and make sure this is straight. Like that. Okay, so I'm happy with the shape. I can already get an indication of what it's going to look like. Now make sure you've got edit pattern selected. Select this internal line, press Ctrl C, then right click and go to mirror paste. So this is pasting this line, but it's mirroring it because I need to paste it on this side. So once I hover over here, make sure those dots reach the end of this line. Now select this internal line, and again I can see what this is going to look like. Alright, hold down shift to select the other one, then right click and go to cut. Now go to transform pattern, select these pieces and delete them, just so it opens up the back of the cap, because that's what we want. Alright, press spacebar to let that simulate, and there we go. So just remember, if you think these lines are really jagged, don't worry about that too much, because if you select these pieces, it's currently still on a particle distance of 10. If you bring that down to 5, it'll make it a lot smoother, but I'm still going to keep it on 10 for now. So let's create the straps. So I'm going to create a rectangle and just drag it out like this. Alright, let's see, maybe move this in a little bit more. I'm referencing that top value. I want that to maybe be 31. That should be fine. Now I'm going to just deselect everything, go to add point over here in the center, right click and do a uniform split. Now I'm going to go to my smooth curve and just click and drag this till it meets that point, and do the same for the bottom. Now select this pattern piece and let me bring this down to 10, and there we go. So this is going to be one of the straps. Now I want to create the strap on the other side. So just select the strap, Ctrl C, then right click and go to mirror paste and paste it over here. And now I'm going to extend the length of this one, so I'll just select this back piece and extend this till it's about, let's see, maybe 44. Actually, might make that a little bit shorter. Actually, maybe just a little bit shorter than that. Alright, I'll bring it to 40. That should be fine. So I want this piece to be longer than the other one, because when we, attaching those buttons together to close the strap, it just makes it a lot easier to do. So now what I want to do is line this up with this line, go to add point and add a point over here. Okay, let's go to our back pattern piece, line it up with the bottom and add a point over here. So now I'm sewing this piece onto this piece, and on this side this piece onto this piece. So here's our pattern pieces over here. I'll just press spacebar and it's going to simulate it in place. So we've got our straps. So the longer pattern piece is going to be behind the shorter one, and essentially we're going to be sewing this onto this piece to close the strap. Alright, so remember, if your button on top of your cap moved, just make sure you're not in the simulation, go to select and move, select that button and just move it down. Alright, super easy to adjust, and then I'll move it to the center over there. Sometimes that does happen, but you can easily just move it back into place. Right, so let's add, those holes on here for our strap. So I'm going to go to internal ellipse, and I'll drag, or I'll start over here, left click, and I want to make my circumference 10. Click on OK. And now I want to go to transform pattern. Press Ctrl C and Ctrl V, so you can see it's making my duplicate. Now, instead of pressing left click to place this duplicate, I'm going to right click, and then this is a cool shortcut because now I can choose the interval, so the distance I want these duplicates to be, but I can also choose the number of duplicates that I want. So in this case, I want 6, and I'm just going to increase the interval over there. So that should be fine. And then I'm going to click on OK. So my interval is 6. I just need to remember that for the other side. Right, so let's go to this one. Internal ellipse. I'll do it over there. Right, internal ellipse. Left click first. Go to circumference. Put this on 10. Click on OK. Go to my transform pattern. Make sure this is selected. Then Ctrl C, Ctrl V. Now instead of left clicking to place the duplicate, right click. So my interval was on 6. And on this side, I'm going to create 4. Alright, there we go. And click on OK. Now I'm just going to select all of these patterns, maybe move it forward just a little bit. Right, so we've got all of these pieces on our strap, and we're going to be cutting them off and sewing them back on. So now I'm going to, while I'm using transform pattern, hold on shift and just select all of these pieces and do the same for the other side. And then right click and go to cut and sew. Right, so it cut those pieces off, and I'm just going to move this up. So it cut them off and it sewed it back on. Now I'm going to select these pattern pieces, and I want to put the thickness over here on, let's put on a value of 1. And then these pieces I'm going to put on 1.5. Right, just to create a nice thickness offset. Okay, apply that, and there we go. So I'm just going to turn off internal lines. Now you can see we've got this detail on here. Right, now, so in order to sew this together, because this is obviously still hanging loose, I want to sew this button over here onto the third button on the longer one. So I need to click over here to see exactly which one it is. So that's going to be this area. So you want to go to your free sewing. Click over here to create your first sew, go all the way around and left click to create your first segment sew. Then on this piece you're going to left click, go all the way around, and then left click again, and you can see it's going to sew those pieces together. So now when I press spacebar, our strap is basically closed. Right? And it's creating the illusion that these other pieces are also sewed together, but you just needed to sew one, and you still have this nice hanging piece of fabric over there. So that's how you close the strap. So there's an adjustment I want to make to the back. I actually feel like this, this whole region over here is maybe a little bit too small. So the easiest way to adjust this would be to select these lines. Right click and go to offset internal line. I'm going to do that by 5, and I want to do that for the other side as well. Right, offset internal line by 5. Now I'm going to right click and cut. So cut these pieces off and delete them, and do the same on the side. So cut and delete. Then just move this in place over here, so I can add that dot back on this region, and just make sure you're sewing this back onto the cap, and then do the same thing here. Place a dot and sew this together. I can move this back up over here. So you can see I just made this region a lot wider, and I personally prefer this. Alright, it's even got a little bit of this bending loose fabric over here, which is what I wanted. So I think this looks a little bit better than what it looked like previously. But there we go, we are officially done with the strap on the cap. So at this point with the cap, we've done quite a lot. Now the next part I want to talk about is the seams on here. Now if you go to this option over here called Show 3D Seam Lines, you can see there's a very prominent seam on your garment, but don't believe what you're seeing right now, because when you export your garment, you're not going to see your seams like this. Right? When you deselect this, this is what your garment looks like. So if you're still happy with this, you feel like maybe some of the seam lines are prominent enough for you, then that's fine. You can still continue working on it, but I want to show you a cool trick that you can use since we're using thickness on how to accentuate some of these seams just to make them pop a little bit more. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to select my brim over here, and I'm actually going to bring the thickness down to 1,5. Press OK. Right, so to make the seams pop a lot more, I'm going to go to my transform pattern and just hold on shift and select all of these pieces. Now I'm going to right click and go to offset as internal line. But when I'm offsetting this, I want my distance to be quite small, so I'll put it on 1 because I want the distance to be, very similar to the overall width of a seam. So I'll put that on 1, click on OK. Now you can see all of the internal lines are selected. While it's selected, just hover over one of the internal lines, right click and go to cut and sew. Right now all of these pieces are still selected, so just click and drag and move them up here. Okay, so I've basically separated off all of the areas by the seam. Now I'm going to select these pieces, right, and I'm going to offset the thickness. So I'm going to make this a little bit thicker. I'm going to put it on 2,5 and then press enter. So I'm offsetting the thickness. So these areas over here, obviously because it doesn't have as much thickness as the rest of the garment, is almost creating like an indentation over there. So it's just a little trick that you can use regarding thickness. So you can see these seam lines are a lot more prominent now by using this method, right? Especially here you can see, and it's just an illusion using thickness. Even with the eyelets, it made them pop as well. Alright, so I just wanted to accentuate that. You could use a layer clone, but I don't think the layer clone works that well, especially with the cap. So I did find an alternative method just to bring some of those seams back. So now I want to create some more internal lines so I can create some top stitching detail on here. So just make sure this is enabled. I'm going to make sure I've got transform pattern selected, select all of these pieces, go back to my edit pattern, right click, and then you want to select offset as internal line and put this on a value of 5 and click on OK. So I'm going to be referencing this internal line to create the top stitching. So now on the rim of the cap, I'm selecting all of these edges over here, right click and offset as internal line. This time the number of offsets that I want to put that on 3 and then click on OK. So there'll be some top stitching on the rim of the cap as well. So I actually want my eyelets over here to stick out. So I'm going to just click and drag over all of these pieces. And I'm going to put the thickness over here on 3. Right. And just simulate. So I want them to be sticking out like that because that's just a lot more accurate. Now, of course, our button here at the top has moved. But as always, you can reposition that very easily. So before we actually add our top stitching on here, especially with the brim, you'll notice that with this segment line or this internal line that was created, there's a break in these segments because of these points, and we need to make sure this is one continuous segment. So to do that, hold on shift and select all of these dots, then right click and go to convert to curve point. So now we've got one continuous line. That's exactly what we want. Now if we go to this option over here called segment top stitch, you can see I can select this entire stitching region, and if I hide this, I've officially, or should I say, I've quickly and easily created some top stitching. So I want to do that for this line and this line as well. Now you can go to your default top stitch. You can even change the shape, right? If you want to overlock stitch or something completely different, it's super easy to do. Now this does get exported out as geometry, which can sometimes make garments, a little bit heavy on export. But if you did want a solution for creating stitching like this, then here you go, and you can see just how simple it is. You can also change the color of the stitching on your cap. So I'm going to be doing that for the rest of the garment. So now I'm actually going to go back to fabric, select brim, and just copy this and then name this eyelets. And I'm going to select all of my eyelets over here and select eyelets, select that fabric, and then I can change the color. Right, and if you feel like this is still way too low poly, you can select all of your eyelets, and because it's an extremely small piece of fabric on this garment, you can even bring this particle distance down to 1. Now this is usually a particle distance that I never go down to, with complex garments, but this is such a small piece of fabric that will still work. Your performance should still be fine, and you can see that made it nice and round. So you can bring that all the way down to 1. Right, and then I've got my top stitching on there, and you can see this cap has really started to take shape now. So the last bit of top stitching that I want to add is, I want to add some top stitching around the cap so that it looks like all of these panels are actually stitched together. So just go to your top stitch over here in the object browser, select default top stitch, then go to your segment top stitch, and we're just going to sew or add some top stitching to all of these regions. So just left click and left click on all of these regions over here. Make sure you're not missing any, just so it creates a complete top stitch. And I think these are some nice, like final touches. It's almost like adding the icing on top of the cake. It adds a lot more believability to these garments. Right, it almost looks like this garment has been stitched together. And since there's different panels, it definitely makes sense to have all of the stitching there. So there we go. And I'll just press spacebar to simulate and stop again. Right, so we got all of this additional stitching on our cap, and then you can always go back to default top stitch and you can change the color here to whatever you want. Remember, you can even change the length and the overall spacing between the stitches. Go ahead, experiment with this and see what you can end up doing. But there we go, we got some nice stitching on our cap. So I'm going to make another fabric over here for the strap in the back. If you don't have this, obviously you don't need to be doing this. So I'm going to select my eyelets, copy this, and I'll just call this strap, and just find my straps over here with these two pieces. Select strap, select my strap, and I'm going to make this a lot darker. So like that. Now those buttons really pop out. And now the buttons on the back of the strap, I also want them to have their own material. So I'll just say copy, and I'll just call this buttons back, and go and find all of those buttons. So all of these pieces, hold on shift and all of these pieces, and just change it to buttons back. Select buttons back, and I'm just going to make this a lot lighter like that. Right, so now I can apply my own separate material onto all of these different panels and onto the rim. So at this point we could actually be considered done with this garment. So congratulations, you've officially created a cap. But I just want to push it a little bit further. I want to add a fabric material on here, and I created my own tileable fabric material. It's from my Gumroad fabric pack. So it's called 56 fabric materials complete pack, all at 4K resolution. So I'm going to use one of these materials. I'm going to go to cap main. Over here by texture, if I click on these 4 dots, I can go ahead and select this fabric 19, bring this into the program. So now I want to go to color and make sure this is completely on white, and click on OK, because white is going to give you the accurate representation of what this texture is supposed to look like. And then I'm actually going to increase the roughness a little bit, so it just reduces some of the specularity. And very important here with the transformation and texture, I want to decrease this width to 200 so that I can actually see my tileable pattern. So you can see this makes a huge difference. This was a fabric material that I scanned, and it just adds some more detail and texture to the surface. Instead of something being just completely flat like that. Right, this adds some more believability. So now at the end, the last thing that I would do, and I just noticed it right now, is that you see these buttons on the back, there actually isn't supposed to be buttons over here. These are just supposed to be holes. So all of these pieces, I'll just select them and delete them. Right, just remove them from the back strap over here. And there we go. So now we got all of those holes. Now I can also reduce the particle distance just to allow more quality on the garment, and just to see how this is actually reducing the particle distance, I'm going to select mesh. So you can see this entire mesh is triangulated. So all of these pieces over here, the brim and all of these panel pieces, I'm just holding on shift and selecting all of this as well as the strap. Right, I'm going to bring that all the way down to a particle distance of 3. If your computer cannot handle 3, then just bring it all the way down to 5. So you can see that subdivided the mesh, and it's allowing a lot more detail. And then these smaller details like these buttons over here. Right, let's go back to thick textured surface, because they still look low poly, but because this is such a small fabric piece in the garment, I can actually bring this down to 2 or even 1 on my particle distance. But again, if it is affecting your performance, then obviously just try a higher number. So I'll bring that down to 1, and you can see that works fine. Still a little bit blocky, but it's still okay. It looks way better than it did previously. And these eyelets, I would do the exact same thing. So I would select all of them and bring that down to 1, just so it makes it a lot rounder. Now these pieces over here, they are quite insignificant. Remember, it's the gaps over here by the seams. These can actually stay on 10, right? Because you're not really going to see them that much. So I actually keep it on 10. So I'll reduce my particle distance, and this would be the final garment at its final resolution. So now I also want to make sure my UVs are nice and organized. So whenever we draft patterns over here, we're actually creating our UV map. So if I go to this drop down arrow, click on UV editor, you can see everything's just all jumbled up, and I want to pack this into one tile. So you right click and go to reset UV to 2D arrangement, then right click and go to fit all UV to 01. So I'm going to select length on absolute, click on OK. So it packs everything in here. I can maybe select all of these pieces and just scale them up. So the more space that each of these pieces take in one tile, the higher the textile density is going to be, which means that the quality of materials are going to look a lot better. And that really comes in handy, especially if you plan on going over to Substance Painter. And the thing is, you can even create UDOMs. So I could select 2 pieces like this, scale them up, and place them in their own tile like this, and put each piece in its own tile. And now I'm allowing more textile density and higher quality. But for the sake of this tutorial, and even if I'm going over to Blender or Cinema 4D, just packing it into one tile like this so it's nice and organized is still perfectly fine. So we are done with our UVs. We can go back to simulation, and now maybe if I was going to ZBrush, I would actually go to edit, select all, so it selects the entire garment. Go to go to edit, context menu, 3D garment, and then quadrangulate. So it will turn those triangles into quads, and that's just a much better surface to sculpt on in ZBrush. Okay, so now I want to show you my method for exporting out the garment, as well as exporting out buttons and top stitching. So they can all be exported out as their own separate OBJs, or the top stitching can be baked onto the map just to make a more optimized mesh. Right, and this works for any garment. So let me show you how this is done. So with the exporting process, I'm going to be exporting this entire cap as a single OBJ. Now you can be a lot more organized and create individual OBJs for every, separate piece on your garment. In this case, all of these panels and the brim could be its own OBJ. All of these eyelets I could export as an OBJ, but I want to show you how to do the entire cap. Now if your garment is using top stitching, I highly recommend doing this. Go to top stitch, right, wherever you created your top stitching. Now my thread thickness over here is quite small, it's on 0.2. I would recommend increasing this at least to 0.8, just to make the thickness of your top stitching a lot thicker, so that this is a lot more visible on the diffuse, because this will be baked into the diffuse map. But even when we export this out as an OBJ, it will also look really nice. So now what we want to do is go to edit, select all, just to make sure everything is selected over here. So edit, select all. Then you want to go to file, export OBJ selected. And now on your desktop, create a folder for this garment. I created a folder called cap. So I'm going to be exporting out the cap on its own, which is the main garment. And then there's a button on top of the cap. So I created a folder for button and a folder for top stitching. So let's do cap main. So I'll call this cap main and click on save. So over here, this is important. I want to select all patterns. And then with the graphics and trims, I just want to deselect button, because I want to export out the button as its own. And I'm going to leave top stitch enabled, because the top stitching is going to be baked as a material. Now I want multiple objects, and this garment was created with thickness, so I want thickness selected. And very important, make sure you select unified UV coordinates, or else your main garment over here, the cap, is not going to have UVs. Now this by default is on 2K resolution. I put it on 4K just for better quality. And then I want the diffuse and the normal. So with the diffuse, any materials that you brought into the program are going to be baked into the diffuse map, but the top stitching will be baked into that diffuse map as well. So now I want this at centimeters, 100%, and save with absolute texture, and click on OK. So if we go to our cap main folder and open up the diffuse and just zoom in over here, you can see that all of the top stitching has been baked onto this texture. So that's a fantastic way to create an optimized mesh. But I definitely want to show you how to export this out of the program as well as an OBJ. So let's go back to Marvelous Designer. So let's do the top stitching first. You want to go to edit, select all. Then you want to go to file, export OBJ selected. Now remember, we created a top stitching folder. So I'll just go to top stitch. and click on save. Now, very important over here, I know we clicked on select all, and I just do that as a safety measure, but you actually want to deselect this. And now on graphics and trims, we just want to export the top stitching, so no buttons. I want this on multiple objects and thick. And now, very important, in order to export our top stitching from the program, you need to make sure that unified UV coordinates is deselected. Then I want this at centimeters 100%, and I'll leave the rest of this default and click on OK. Right, so that is the top stitching. So now for the button, so buttons in MD can actually be exported with UVs. So just go to Edit, Select All, File, Export, OBJ Selected, and I'm going to go to Button, name this button, click on Save. Now I remember deselect, select all patterns, and over here by graphics and trims, I don't want top stitching, just the button. And over here I can actually enable this. So I can enable unified UVs for the button. This works with buttons. If you've got buttonholes with your garment, then you will have to deselect UVs, but we're just working with a button over here. And diffuse map, so any materials, again, if you did apply a separate texture onto the button, it will actually be baked into that button's UV map as well. And then I want this on centimeters 100% and click on OK. So I just opened up Blender quickly. I want to show you what these OBJs look like in another program. So file, import OBJ, and let's import our main garment first. So cap main, click on OBJ. So it's going to load in our cap. Alright, there we go. I'm just going to change my viewport shading. Now this is just the main garment on its own, you know, without any buttons or top stitching as an OBJ. But you'll see that the top stitching is baked directly onto this material. So that is fantastic. This is more of an optimized mesh. But now I want to bring in my button. So I want to go to File, Import OBJ, and find my button over here. So import the button, and there we go. And since I exported that, you know, with unified UVs for the button, any material that was on there, it automatically applied it onto that button. Now let's import our top stitching. So File, Import OBJ, top stitch, and you'll see it'll import all of that top stitching as its own OBJ as well. So you can see if I move this to the side, the top stitching is its own separate OBJ, and so is our button at the top. So that's fantastic. Right, and the cool thing about having top stitching as its own separate OBJ, that means that if I go to my materials over here, like if I go to the shading viewport, just to show you quickly, it means that I can now apply a separate color onto my top stitching. Oh, let me make sure I'm actually selecting the correct object, my top stitch. So now I can change the color of this in the program. That's why it's nice to have your top stitching as a separate OBJ as well. Alright, but of course it can make your scenes heavy, so you do have the option of baking that directly onto the material, which is this result over here. So now you know the entire exporting process for exporting your main garment and any graphics and trims, whether it's buttons or top stitching. Alright, so I hope that has been useful. So here's just a bonus final tip. If you still want to accentuate the intensity of these seams, here's a really neat trick that you can use. So I'm going to go to Edit Pattern, hold on Shift and just select all of these lines. Right over here, make sure I'm selecting all of these lines. So just the edges over here where the seams are. Right, and then what you want to do is you want to right click, offset as internal line by 1 millimeter. Right, now it will automatically select those internal lines. And then over here on the right you can see fold. If I put this on 100, and then let me just press spacebar to simulate this. If I increase this fold angle, you can see what it starts doing to the seam area. Right, it's folding it in on that region, but it's really accentuating these lines over here where it's sewed together. You can play around with that. You can see what it does with the inverse, but I thought I would just show you in case you wanted to, you know, make these seam lines a little bit more prominent. This works really, really well. Now, of course, the button moved over there, but I've already showed you how you can move it back to the center. But I just wanted to cover this in case this is something you wanted to do where you wanted more prominent seam lines on the cap. And now I'm also going to do that for these bottom lines over here. Now these are just some final little details I'm adding on. So I'm going to offset this internal line by 2. It'll select all of those internal lines, put my fold strength on 100. Let me simulate this and then increase the... Actually, I'm going to decrease this number right now. And you can see what it starts doing here. It creates like a little bit of a bulge around the bottom of the cap, which I think looks pretty cool. You can see it. It's also here on top of the cap. So just some additional minor detail that's being added. And then the last tip, I would say, don't be afraid to play around with different fabric presets. You can go to cap main, try something else that generates more folds. You can maybe try nylon featherweight or denim lightweight. You see I'll press spacebar, and when I move this around, this fabric is still rigid, right? It's got some rigidity applied to it, but it will still generate some additional fabric on here. So definitely play around with some other fabric presets to get this cap to behave differently if you want more folds on here. Right? Experiment. That's also the whole point of this, is to experiment. And I want to show you another super awesome trick if you want to change the overall style of this cap. Like if you want to change it from a dad hat into just a different style of cap, you just need to adjust 2 settings. So if I select all of these pieces over here, you'll see on the right there's an option called shrinkage weft and shrinkage warp. This adds fabric horizontally, this does it vertically. So if I increase this number by, let's say, 120 and 120, right, press enter and press spacebar, you can see it starts adding more fabric. Now if your simulation's not working, just switch to GPU simulation, then switch back to normal, and it should work. So you can see it just added more fabric on my garment, which made the cap a lot bigger. So you can play around with that, make these caps bigger with more fabric. It's just a quick way to, you know, alter the style of the cap. So I thought I would mention that. So it's just that weft and warp value. I maybe bring this back to 100. See, like now it's not working, so I jump to fast GPU, then jump back to normal and press spacebar, and then it works. Seems like it's just some error with the program itself. But this is just another way that you can alter the style of the cap just by playing around with the weft and the warp. Okay, and that's going to be my final tip for this course, and I hope you learned something useful from this. Okay, so that's going to be the end of this course. Now, I hope you learned something useful from watching this video. Now, if you want to go ahead and support me as an artist, you can head on over to my Gumroad store. I've put links in the description, and you can learn how to create 9 additional hats. But I wanted to share one of the courses with my YouTube community completely for free. So let me know what you think. And as always, I truly appreciate the support on this channel so much. You guys are super awesome. Stay tuned for some more videos and tutorials, and goodbye.